the Public Information Officer and the expert guru for the Freedom of Information Act Commission. Tom's going to lead us through the Freedom of Information Act tonight. He's very knowledgeable, and those who are still on the meeting at the end may ask questions. Tom, take it away.
John, thank you. Thank you all for the invitation. We do these workshops all over the state. Well, not from my house, but we go to the different boards and commissions. When you ask us to come, we're delighted to do it. The goal is not to beat you up, not to make you miserable. It's to try to help, is try to answer your questions when it comes to freedom of information, to try to give you some tools to work with so that if you have an instance where freedom of information is an issue, you're better equipped to handle it. I'd obviously much rather be in person, but we do what we have to do. So you'll have to just deal with me on the screen today and hope that we get through and get you the information that you need. I always tell people a little bit about me before we start, just so that it's clear I'm not an attorney. I don't know if that's good news or bad news. I don't know how you feel about that, but I share that because I'm not in a position to give you any binding legal opinions. These are not orders from the commission. I've been doing these workshops for a little more than 21 years. The idea is to teach, to help, to try to answer your questions. So as we go forward, obviously we can ask and answer questions at the end, but if you have them as we're going forward, you want to unmute and ask them. Sometimes the conversation gets better when you ask questions. I'll say something and you'll say, gee, that's not how we do it, or that's not how I understood it. And then maybe we can get into a better understanding of what we need to know. The other thing I'll share with you is that many of you I know are members of boards and commissions, volunteering your time, trying to do good things for Groton. A lot of times when I do these workshops, especially at night, people say, hey, Tom, you don't understand. You don't get it. We're volunteers. We didn't sign up for this FOI stuff. We signed up to help the town, to do something positive for the town. And I just want to share with you that I also understand that sentiment. For 10 years, I was on a board in my town. I chaired it for the last 5. I was a member of our Board of Selectmen for a couple of years, filling out an unexpired term. And then I'm also been placed on yet another board so that I know what it's like. I know what it's like to sign up to do something positive for the community and then find yourself in a situation where you're dealing with something like freedom of information. And you said, but that's not what I thought I was getting into. But you have to understand that that is what you have to get into. It's the law in the state of Connecticut, and it governs a lot of what public officers, public officials, public boards will do. And it's something that you need to know enough about so you don't find yourself struggling with freedom of information, that you instead are able to concentrate on the roles that you have with the town and focus on your work rather than trying to stay out of difficulties when it comes to FOI. The law is 47 years old. Just as a little bit of background, it was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. If you do the math, 47 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. You had a country that was beside itself with trouble. It was beside itself, nearing a constitutional crisis, primarily because a lot of things were being done behind closed doors, being done in secret. And Ella was in Congress when Watergate kind of exploded all around us. And she was watching all this happen, and she said, if I run for governor and I win, one of the first things I'm going to make sure I do is create some sort of an open government law so that what I'm watching happen around me here in Washington doesn't happen in Connecticut. And as you know, she ran, she won, and literally one of the first things that she did when she got into office was put forward this concept of an open government law for the state of Connecticut. She put it forward and she said, this is so important for our state. This is so critical to how we operate that I'm going to see to it that this law is passed unanimously by our legislature. I want you to chew on that for a second. Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on this or on any law? Well, I'm here to tell you she guaranteed it and she got it. I've actually seen a video of the vote. There wasn't a single no vote in the House, not a single no vote in the Senate. This law passed unanimously. Now, that brings us back kind of to why we're here today. It shows you how important the law is, how important it was back then, how important it remains today. But also, frankly, it gives us some insight as to why we have to have these kinds of discussions, why we have to have these kinds of workshops. Because to get to the point where everybody voted yes, I want you to think about the negotiation that had to go on, the back and forth, the arm twisting, that I like this, I don't like that. So you've got a law that's based on a really simple, easy concept. But when you read it, and I know I see a couple names up here of people I know who've tried to read it, your eyes will roll to the back of your head, the wherefores and the whereases and the wait a minute. My instinct tells me this, but the law seems to tell me that. That's because, folks, there's a lot in this law that when you're trying to work with it, when you're trying to do the right thing, you have to be able to interpret it, sometimes on the fly. Gee, should we be in executive session? Is that a proper reason for executive session? Is that a document we should be giving out? And you have to look at it and say, it's not really clear, but I think I know the answer. And you have to be able to interpret the law, and you have to have the tools to be able to do that, which brings us back to why we have these conversations, to give you those tools so that when you have a situation where you have to make a decision, you're better equipped to do it. And the reason you want to do that is you don't want to be in a circumstance where you've done something and someone says, you know what, they did it wrong. And they file a complaint against you with the Freedom of Information Commission, which was created as part of this law in 1975, which is where people go when they believe they've been denied the rights guaranteed them by the FOI Act. Our commission will hear a complaint from someone who's made a request or thinks you've done something improper against the public agency, and the commission's role is to adjudicate it, to make a decision and say, Groton, you were correct in that circumstance, or Groton, you were wrong. And that becomes what you want to do. So the bottom line is to avoid going to the Freedom of Information Commission with, to defend yourselves and to do it correctly the right way. But I'll just one sort of thing to add there, just because someone files a complaint against you, I don't know if any of you have ever been under that, had that happen to you. It doesn't automatically mean that you're wrong, because there's so much that's subject to interpretation in this law. You could be in a situation where you're absolutely certain you've done it right. Someone could still file a complaint. Just remember that doesn't automatically mean that you're wrong. What it means is that someone believes that you have not interpreted the law correctly. And if you've done your homework, if you know what the right steps are to take, I'm going to argue that more often than not, you'll be okay. Again, we're going to leave you with the ability to make the right decisions, I hope, in the next hour that we talk. The Freedom of Information Act is about two basic things. It's about access to public meetings and access to public records. I'm going to focus on the meetings provisions tonight because we don't have an endless amount of time. You guys have another meeting, I think, right after this. But if I don't cover something, if I don't hit on something, it doesn't mean that it's not important. I want you to ask about it so that we can try to, again, answer your questions. And if we don't get to it tonight, you now have a face to put with a voice on the other end of the phone. I spend most of my time during the day answering questions on the phone. Let's see, today's tally was 25 phone calls, emails. I will get you an answer. If I don't know the answer, I'm not afraid to tell you I don't know the answer. And I'll get you an answer. Again, that's not an order or a command either. It's just some guidance, and you can take that and make your decision with that. So when we talk about meetings, let me read, I don't read a lot of definitions, but listen to the words. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Folks, the bottom line is that when you gather to do your work as a board or as a commission, consider it a meeting. Make sure it's properly noticed. Make sure that it's open to the public. The public has access. And then make sure that there are minutes of that meeting when the meeting is done. People will come up to me, they'll call and they'll say, Tom, we've got some really sensitive issues to talk about. We'd really be better served if we discuss it in private. Now, listen, I get that, but in the private sector, that's exactly what we do. But in the public sector, you can't do that. If you're going to gather to talk about something that's important, you've got to remember that it's a meeting. It's part of the public process. We're going to form a little subcommittee. Subcommittee is not the full board. It's not a quorum of the board. So then we don't need to follow freedom of information, right? Again, wrong. The law says that when you form a subcommittee, it becomes a separate public agency unto itself. I won't read you the full definition, but in the definition of a public agency, including any committee of or created by. So your 9-member board creates a 3-member subcommittee. That 3-member subcommittee becomes a new public agency and needs to follow the same rules. You want to be really careful that you understand that some of these private conversations, yeah, they're going to happen, but you want to avoid having the conversations that you should be having at the table. The law talks to us about 3 different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. Regular meeting is the meeting that you have per schedule that you set up. By now, I hope by the end of January of every year, we meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd and 4th Wednesday, 7 o'clock town hall, or 6 o'clock via Zoom, whatever that schedule is, that becomes your regular meeting schedule. Special meeting is a meeting that you have when you're not scheduled to meet. A lot of people see that word special and they say, oh boy, we can't do this. You can do anything you need to do at a special meeting. Here's the fundamental difference. First of all, for both of those meetings, you need to prepare an agenda. I don't know if any of you have that task, but you want to remember, if you do, that the agenda needs to be as specific as possible. The commission and the courts have come down pretty strongly. They want your agendas to fairly apprise the public as to what's going to happen. That's the wording that we get. So you want specificity. The agenda has to be available at least 24 hours in advance. So the agenda is in 24 hours in advance. And here's the difference. At a regular meeting, should something arise at the meeting that's not on the agenda, someone can say, Madam Chairman, I'd like to add that to the agenda. Someone makes a motion, someone seconds it, 2/3 of you vote to add it to the agenda. You can do that at a regular meeting. At a special meeting, you can't add anything. So if you're preparing the agenda for a special meeting, I don't know about you, but I like to cut and paste when I do an agenda. So items like other business, old business, new business, they're not the greatest items on an agenda, but they work sort of for a regular meeting, because someone can say, Madam Chairman, under old business, I'd like to add this. You can second it, you can vote, you can add it. But at a special meeting, you can't add anything. So if it says other business, old business, one of those categories with nothing listed underneath, you might as well take it off, because you can't use it. You can't say, is there any other business, if it's not specified. Otherwise, you can do anything you need to do at a special meeting. Just make sure it's on the agenda. The third kind of meeting, the emergency meeting. Folks, it's a meeting that I really discourage boards and commissions from using. An emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting. It's a meeting that you have when you have a true emergency. The problem is that what you and I think might be an emergency doesn't necessarily rise to that level in the eyes of the law. The law sets the bar very high. It doesn't want us to meet without notice. So it discourages that by creating an emergency meeting that you can use in a real emergency situation. But you have to remember that, I don't like to say life and death. That's a little dramatic, but keeping people safe, keeping people out of harm's way, those are some of the reasons for an emergency. One of my favorite anecdotes is, and I told you I've been doing this I'm in my 21st year. We have holidays in Connecticut that some towns, celebrate, some towns close, they don't. Every Tuesday after one of those holidays, Columbus Day, Martin Luther King's birthday, it just happened last week. Martin Luther King's birthday is on a Monday. I'll get a call on Tuesday morning. Someone will say, hey, Tom, I've got a problem. What's the problem? Our regular meeting is tonight, Tuesday night. I always make sure the agenda is in town hall the Monday before, 24 hours in advance. I went to do it, and I remembered. I forgot that town hall was closed because of the holiday. So I brought it in this morning. Is that okay? It's not okay. 24 hours is what you need. Well, we've got way too much to do tonight, so I'm going to call this an emergency meeting, and we're going to go ahead with the meeting. Folks, I always discourage that. It's a bad idea. Oops, I forgot. It's not an emergency. In our minds, it feels like it. Think of the time of year we're in now. We're doing a lot. We're working on budgets. We're getting ready, to do a lot of different things. And I get it that there's a lot on the agenda, but if you've not gotten it in 24 hours in advance, calling it an emergency meeting is not a good idea. People say, hey, Tom, what's the big deal? What happens? Well, I'm going to tell you one story about an emergency meeting that backfired on a town and put a town in horrible trouble. That happened a few years ago. The other side of the state from where you guys are, there was a situation where the assistant fire chief believed he was about to become the next chief. He was very excited about this. He was going around town telling everybody he was going to be the next chief. And then he found out that the rumor was false. He was furious. He marches into the first selectman's office, slams the door, and I'm told it was a beauty. Screaming, yelling, cursing, things being thrown, papers being flung all over the place. Finally, the first selectman calms him down and says, look, you're not going to be the next chief. We're going in a different direction. We'll make you the interim chief while we look, but but that's the best we can do. The guy's not happy. He leaves, grumble, grumble. But he says, okay, at least I'm the interim chief. But that town, like many of our towns, like yours, like mine, small town, it doesn't take very long. The word gets out and the phone starts ringing, the emails start coming in, the texts start, this is horrible. He was terrible to you. He was a danger to you. He was threatening you. He was insubordinate. He was unprofessional. You got to do something about that. So the first selectman thinks about it. This is a Friday afternoon. He says, you know what? Maybe there's something to that. He calls an emergency meeting of his board for the next morning. They sit down, they talk about it, they decide they want no part of this guy, they vote to fire him. They go to find him, to tell him this information. They find him, he comes in and he explodes all over again. He says, you blankety blanks can't fire me, I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. Then he thinks about it a little bit and he says, wait a minute, what was the emergency? He's heard somebody tell him that, it's the bar is high, all that stuff. And he says, I'm going to file a complaint. So he files a complaint with the Freedom of Information Commission. The commission hears all that. And by the way, if you've never been involved in one, we always try to mediate the complaint. We don't want you to have to go to a hearing. In this case, it was pretty obvious we weren't going to be able to settle it. It goes to a hearing. The hearing officer gathers all the information and recommends to the FOI commission that the complainant be found in favor of the complainant and that the commission declare null and void what happened at that meeting. The commission agrees and declares null and void what happened at that meeting, which now means that he was fired and or quit at a meeting that didn't happen. End of story. Except it's not the end of the story. Remember I talked to you about matters of interpretation? Well, even the FOI commission can be interpreted. The town didn't like the decision and appealed it and took it all the way to the state Supreme Court. And when it finally got through the state Supreme Court, the court said, we agree with the FOI commission. Now that doesn't always happen either. They don't like our interpretation. That shows you, how fluid this law can be. But in this case, they agreed with us and they declared null and void what happened as well. If you're finance people or you're members of the Board of Finance, I bet it clicked off in your head right away. What's the problem? He's been off the payroll for 5 years because of a meeting that never happened. The Supreme Court issue doesn't get settled in a matter of days or weeks. It's years. And this one was 4 or 5 years. They owed him 5 years of back pay, all because they didn't wait 24 hours to notice a meeting, right? So yes, this is an extreme example of what can happen if you mess up, but always think in terms of, okay, we want to stay out of hot water. We want to make sure that we don't get jammed up because of something silly like that. Think about it. If you have a true emergency, which you may someday, I hope you never do. An example I use is that I was on a board, one of the boards I was on, Board of Education. We had a situation 7, 8 years ago, I think it was now, where it seemed like it snowed 4 or 5 feet every 5 minutes. And that we looked up one day and the snow was piling up on the roofs of the schools and we said, uh-oh, and we couldn't wait 24 hours. We had to hire somebody. We had to get professionals up there to clear the roofs so that we didn't have a real catastrophe on our hands. That was an emergency. If you ever have a situation like that or something similar, you have your meeting, you talk about only the emergency issue, stick to the topic, and then within 72 hours, you should create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. But again, if you can avoid that emergency meeting, you're in a much better place. When you meet in an unnoticed fashion, it automatically sets off alarms. People get worked up and it creates a problem that you just don't need. Your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can attend. So I'm gonna veer off for a second here and talk to you a little bit about this new world that we're in ever since the pandemic hit in March of 2020. It started with the governor's executive orders, and the legislature put it in the section 149 of the Public Act 21-2 that it passed last June. Now these requirements, these provisions are sunsetted as of the end of April of this year. I was sitting in a meeting today where they're talking about ways to extend them. So I have a funny feeling that we're going to see some of these provisions going forward, but right now I can only guarantee you that these are good through the end of April. And we're talking about meeting remotely. The way we're doing here, this isn't a notice meeting, but your meeting that follows this. Here's the deal. The law gives public agencies like yours, like mine, the ability to meet virtually. You can meet completely via electronic equipment. You can meet in a hybrid fashion, partially in person, partially electronically, and you can also meet in person. Now, one of the pieces of the conversation that I heard today was pushing to give the towns, give the communities the option to call it their way. I think that if they try to make it a mandate to do it one way or another, there's going to be all kinds of trouble. So I think they're leaning towards leaving it the way it is now. So right now you have the choice. There's 3 different ways you can meet. Obviously this is born from the pandemic, but they found that some of these meetings are getting better attendance. More people are paying attention. People who have perhaps childcare issues, or people who get home late from work and they don't want to go back out again to all those things, but they're still interested in town business, so they're coming to the meetings this way. Here's what you have to remember. If you're going to meet virtually, you have to get notice of that virtual meeting out there at least 48 hours in advance. Not the agenda, but at least 48 hours in advance, telling people this meeting of the council, this meeting of the Board of Finance is going to have an electronic component to it. At the same time, you put the notice up, you want to make sure it's on your website. You want to make sure that it's in the clerk's office, in your office if you have one, and you want to make sure that you get that link out there so that people can link into the meeting and have real-time access. That's the key, real-time access. Then after 24 hours before, you have to have the agenda in, and again, make sure that link to get people in is available. If the entire meeting, if it's a regular meeting and it's entirely using electronic equipment, you also need to record it. The law says that you need to record the meeting. You need to make the recording available in 7 days. And then you have to make sure that that recording, or I guess you can transcribe it as well, but not too many people do that. And you got to make sure that it's posted on your website and it's retained for 45 days. Again, that is a regular meeting. And if a regular meeting is only electronic. Those provisions of recording do not apply to special meetings, and they do not apply to hybrid meetings. Another couple little twists when it comes to regular meetings is if you get a notice from somebody, a letter, an email, at least 24 hours in advance that says, my computer is broken, or I don't have internet access, and I still want to go to that meeting and it's virtual, the public agency has to find a way to make that meeting available to somebody. Loaning a laptop, putting them in the library, putting them in town hall. This is not something that happens, again, this has been in effect since last July. I haven't gotten any calls about people wanting to do this, but it's right there in the law. So you want to just make sure, that you're aware of it if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I want that to happen. You want to make sure that when you're meeting virtually, that you've got that real-time access. You want to make sure that those of you who are board members, can hear and be heard. You want to make sure that if you make a motion or if you want to speak, that you vote, and when you vote, that it's very clear who's doing the voting. One of the things that I think they're talking about is making the council members, the board members, more visual, I guess would be the word. You might have to have your cameras on or have your microphones on during the meeting so that people can see when you vote. Those are some of the issues that are being kicked around. By the way, I was just sitting in on this meeting. I have nothing, no power over what they do. These are just some of the thoughts that I heard being kicked around. Now I'm talking about real-time access. There's another issue that comes with these virtual meetings. I suspect if you haven't seen them, you know them. If I say Zoom bombing, those of you whom I could see, do you know what I'm talking about when I say Zoom bombing? You've got a situation where people jump into your meeting, and some of them have gotten really nasty, really ugly. I hope that hasn't happened to you. Racial epithets, insults to the board members, basically trying to disrupt and shut down the meeting. You have a right to shut those people down. Yes, you have to provide access, but if anybody disrupts your meeting, you have a right to shut them down, mute them, kick them off, whatever you need to do. You have a right to conduct your business. There's a provision in the law, pre-electronic meetings that allows you to throw people out so that it's still in play if you're doing it virtually. A lot of people think that they have a little more leeway virtually to insult people and to say things, and that's just not the case. You have a right to run an orderly meeting. Let me just share with you I've had one Zoom bombing experience. You might get a kick out of this. I was doing a workshop just like this, and it was for, we'll call them like a League of Women Voters type folks. They, not town officials of any kind. So I'm talking away, and the screen goes blank. It goes black. And I hear this sort of dance reggae music. Now, at the same time I'm doing this, my oldest daughter is an international teacher. And last year during the pandemic, she could not get to her country. They wouldn't let her in. So she was teaching her first graders virtually in Panama from my dining room, right down the stairs there. So we had quite the circus going on here. So I thought that was her kids' music or something like that. And then she yells up the stairs. She says, "Dad, what's that music?" Then I realized it wasn't her. And just as she says that, the strippers parade across the screen in front of me while we're trying to talk about freedom of information. You can't make it up, right? Let me just say that they left very little to the imagination. And the people giving the workshop, I could see them frantically. They finally got them off the screen. Now, that's a funny Zoom bomb, but let me tell you, some of them that I've heard are disgusting, and I hope it never happens to you. But just remember, you still have control. Public speaking in either the virtual world or the in-person world. If you go back to in-person, if it's virtual, remember that nothing in the FOI Act guarantees anybody the right to speak at a public meeting. We have public comment, we encourage it at all of our meetings, but it's not required. So you have control over how long people speak. If they speak on a topic that perhaps you say, look, we talked about this for the last 5 meetings, we're not going to talk about it again. You have that kind of control. Public speaking is not guaranteed under freedom of information. Now, you may have things in bylaws, in your charter, in how you run your boards. That's a whole different story. But when people come to us with complaints about public speaking, we have to kick them out because there's nothing in our act that governs that. My advice to you on public speaking is to be fair and to be reasonable. If you're going to set a time limit because you've got a lot to do, you tell people 3 minutes apiece, but make sure everybody gets the 3 minutes. Now, again, I'm putting on another hat to tell you that, but you just want to make sure that you have control so that you can run your meeting and you can get your work done, get your business done. Now, in this virtual world, we've had situations where people have started sending emails and letters and say, you must read this at the meeting. That would be the same as public speaking. You accept it, it becomes a public record, but whether you read it or not, that's a choice you get to make. And it's not anything that needs to be attached to the minutes. It's a public record. You have to make sure you retain it, but it's nothing that is guaranteed or required by the FOI Act. So we're talking a lot about working in public. There are paths that boards and commissions can go down to exclude the public. You all probably, unless you've never been on a board before, have heard the term executive session. You probably know what I'm talking about. Folks, remember that an executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It is not something that sits on an island by itself. So you've got an executive session item. Let's suppose it's the only item you've got on a given agenda, one item. You still need to notice the meeting. You still need to convene in public. Meeting call to order. Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we go into executive session for one of the 5 reasons. I'll go over those in a second. You make the motion, it's seconded. You need a 2/3 vote to enter executive session. You go into executive session. You have a discussion. You talk for as long as you need to. There's nothing that puts a time limit on any of that. You stick to the topic, of course. You can't talk about other things. You have your discussion. And then if you're going to take action, you come out of the executive session to vote. Don't ever vote behind closed doors. Always make sure that your votes are in public, that the minutes reflect who was in the executive session and who voted for what or for whom. Very critical. Now, the 5 reasons for executive session. The first one, a personnel matter. If you're preparing an agenda or you're making a motion for a personnel executive session, you don't just say personnel. That's another one that's the courts have come down pretty hard on. They want more than just personnel. Executive session planned, discussion of the performance of a public works employee, discussion of the performance of a teacher, discussion of the performance of a police officer. You don't necessarily have to name the individual. There are court cases that say that too. but you do have to give a little more than just personnel or personnel matter. Then you need to make sure that the person who's going to be discussed is notified. The person needs to be notified in advance that he or she is going to be discussed in an executive session. The person then has the right to come forward and say, no, 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 I don't want that to be an executive session. I want that discussion to be held in public. I want everybody to hear it. And if the person comes forward and says that and doesn't back down, then you must have the discussion in public. That's the individual's right. Where people get confused is they think, wait a minute, they're going to talk about me in executive session. I have to be in the room. And that's not a right that the person has. The person only has the right to demand it be in public. Once he or she waives that, whether that person goes into the executive session with you is up to you. Now, many times, boards invite people in that executive session or any of them. You're welcome to do that, to hear somebody's side of the story, to use their expertise, to ask them for advice. You can do all of those things. You can always bring somebody into executive session, but it's your call. You invite them in. Nobody has a right technically to be in there other than members of the board. The executive session for the next one, pending claims and pending litigation. It's pretty much what it sounds like. There is a lawsuit. There is a CHRO complaint. There's a grievance. You want to talk about your strategy. You want to decide how you're going to handle that. Well, the law says that you can go into executive session to talk about that without tipping off your strategy in a public session. It's a little broader than that in that it allows you to go into executive session to discuss taking legal action. You want to take action against some, you're on a building committee and you don't like what one of the contractors is doing. You want to try to pull the bond or make sure that they do the job properly, but you don't want them to know what your strategy is going to be to deal with that. You could have that discussion behind closed doors as well. The third one, executive session for a security matter. That one never used to come up much in the beginning of my FOI career, but sadly it's come up a lot more in particular since 2012 when Sandy Hook happened. It happens a lot with boards of education, but the town boards, the boards of finance, and the governing boards get pulled into. Extra resource officers for the school, bulletproof glass, escape routes, all those things that we never had to worry about, when I was in school, but now they're an issue. And clearly you'd want to have those discussions behind closed doors. On the off chance that the wrong people were sitting in the audience, very people you're trying to keep out, you don't want to let them know how you're going to do that. Another security measure for executive session has come up recently, cybersecurity. You have a situation where your system has been hacked or you're worried about a virus or something like that, and you want to go into executive session to talk about how you're going to prevent that or how you're going to keep the hackers out. Again, on the off chance that the wrong people are sitting in the audience, you wouldn't have to reveal your strategy or at least what you're thinking about doing. So that would be another security executive session. The fourth one, a land transaction. You're going to buy a piece of property to build a new police station. You're going to lease a piece of property that you own. You have an old building that you're going to try to sell. All those kinds of negotiations could take place behind closed doors. You wouldn't have to tip your hand as, oh, gee, the town is offering this, we'll offer more. You wouldn't have to have those conversations in public because you would harm the town's position by doing that. The fifth one is a little bit broader too. It allows you to talk about the contents of a document or documents that you believe are exempt from disclosure. You are a board you're the Board of Education, you put your transportation contract out to bid. You get bids from all the different bus companies, DATCO and First Student, Durham Services, they all submit bids. Well, there's an exemption in the FOI Act that allows you to withhold the content of bids or RFPs until you've actually signed a contract. So as a board, you could go into executive session to talk about the content of those documents because you believe those documents are exempt from disclosure. You could do that. Just as an aside on that one, that exemption goes away once you've signed the contract. So that's not a permanent exemption. It's one that you can look at them and study them and review them, discuss them. But once you sign the contract, once you make a deal, then all that information goes out. Another example there might be, let's suppose you ask your attorney for a written legal opinion. You become the client. That means the written legal opinion is covered by the attorney-client privilege. You wouldn't share it with anybody. So you share it amongst yourselves. You want to talk about that advice that your attorney has given you. You have the right to do that. And because you're not sharing that written legal advice with anybody else. Remember, I can't stress it enough. Do not take action behind closed doors. I know too many boards that have come out of executive session and proudly announced that we've just decided to, and someone files a complaint because it was clear that they had voted behind closed doors. Don't do it. Make sure that you take your action in public. In addition to executive session, there's another path that boards and commissions can go down to talk about things. And it's kind of interesting. It's one of those that makes it very difficult sometimes to have these conversations. I read you the definition of a meeting, pretty all-inclusive. Then you see a next sentence that says, meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. There follows a listing of things, every single one of which we all would say, gee, that sounds a lot like a meeting. The legislature says, fine, you want to call it a meeting, but for the purposes of freedom of information, it's not a meeting, which means it's something that feels like a meeting, but you don't need to notice it. It's not open, and there are no minutes. The big one on that list is collective bargaining. If you're involved in collective bargaining at all, your collective bargaining sessions are not open to the public. There are no minutes. There's no agenda. You can do that anywhere you want. I always found that one somewhat sort of puzzling because if you think about it, especially in a smaller town, if you're negotiating a contract with a union, it's a huge piece of your budget. You would think that would be more public than it is, but it's just not. Executive level search committee. Your police chief retires. You want to look for a new chief? You form an executive level search committee to look for a new chief. Now that one makes a little more sense to me because you're looking for the best possible candidates. And if you're looking for the best possible candidates, you're going to get applications for people who are already employed and don't want their current employers to know that they're looking. So that one I kind of get. Another one that gives me a chuckle. You're allowed to have a chance meeting or a social meeting, neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. You're good friends on the board. You're going to go out to dinner. You're going to go to Abbott's one summer night. You're going to have dinner, right? I ask you, what else are you going to talk about, right? You're probably going to talk about business. Now, folks, let's not be naive. Let's be smart about this. Those conversations are probably going to happen. But what you want to remember is that you don't want to have those deep deliberative conversations that you should be having at the meeting. You're setting yourself up for a problem. Yeah, okay. Can you believe what happened at the last meeting? What do you want on the next agenda? I mean, general conversation is probably going to be okay, but always understand that the one time you lose sight of that and you get into a heated debate over a subject, I guarantee you the wrong person sitting at the next table says that they've had an illegal meeting and files a complaint. And they'd be right. You do not want to have those kinds of meetings offline. You want to be careful the extent to which you have those conversations with each other in social or chance or, non-meeting settings. Be really careful about that. One of my favorite lines is, do not set the budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Be really smart about it. Another provision that falls into that category is the caucus. A lot of people say, well, gee, what does that mean? Well, that means that members of the same board and the same party can caucus. Now, if you think about that one, that's kind of a loophole, a giant one. You have a board, 7 members are of the same party. You telling me that the 7 of them can go off and talk about whatever they want? Yep. Remember that the legislators wrote this and they wanted to get a unanimous vote. We think this is one of the key elements that got that vote to go in a unanimous way. Yes, it's a loophole, but be careful. Oh, gee, I had a conversation with someone just before I got on with you guys today. Well, let's see. If the Democratic members of the Board of Finance and the Board of Education get together, that's a caucus, right? No, it's not same board, same party. That's 2 different boards. That's a problem. That could be a meeting of one of those 2 boards. Same board, same party only. You want to be really careful about that. And, along the lines of being smart and being careful, when I read you the definition of a meeting, you probably heard the phrase, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. That was put into the law back in 1975 for the powerful chairman. I suspect we have 1 or 2 watching us tonight who will get on the phone and say, you need to do this and you need to do that and da 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 da. Well, you can't have your meeting on the phone before the meeting takes place. You want to make really sure that you don't do that. And when we talk about electronic equipment today, we're talking about a lot more than telephones. How do we communicate today, especially, you know, in the beginning of the pandemic when nobody was going out? We were emailing, we were texting, we were Twitter and Facebook and all those things. I'm not telling you to abandon those platforms. You can certainly use them. But again, don't engage in the kind of deliberative conversations that you should be having at your meeting. Chairman sends out a position paper on something. Guys, I feel really strongly about this. I want you all to read it. I'm going to bring this up at the next meeting. This is how I think we ought to go. Well, that's okay. That's okay. But the problem when you do that is somebody jumps in and says, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Then somebody else jumps in and says, no, wait a minute, I really like that idea. And the next thing you know, you're having an argument via email that you should be having at a meeting. Cut those off. Use the email and the text. Feel free to use them to disseminate information, to send out position papers, to send out agenda items. That's all well and good. But just don't have the kind of discussions, the debates that you should be having at your meetings. And people say, well, what's the big deal? Well, the bigger problem, in addition to having an improper meeting, is that those emails, those texts become public records. And someone can say, I want to see any and all emails between council members about topic A. You'd have to produce them. And the next thing you know, not only do you have a problem with an illegal meeting, you've probably tipped your hand on an issue that you really didn't want to tip your hand on yet. And let's face it, folks, sometimes when we email and text, we're not as artful as we might be at a public meeting. And the language that's in there might make you feel uncomfortable. All of those things. Be really careful the extent to which you use those kind of devices. The last thing with meetings, before I give you a couple of minutes about the records provisions. Minutes. I don't know if any of you are responsible for minutes. My advice on minutes is that they need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not meant to be every word that everybody says. They are not meant to be verbatim transcripts. Technically, the only requirement for minutes is a record of who votes for what or for whom. That's the only real requirement by law. Now, you want more than that. You're creating Groton's historical record, but how much you put in there is in your hands. You get people who will stand up in a meeting and deliver this passionate speech and say, I want every word of this in the minutes. Not required. You put in there what you need to put in there to tell the story, but not at the expense of making you or your clerk crazy. Get them, do them, submit them in 7 days, and move on to the next event. Now, I'm watching the clock. I'm mindful of a 6:30. I'm just going to give you a couple minutes about the records provisions, because it's, if this were a discussion with primarily staff, we would focus on the records issues. Let me read you the definition of a public record. Public records or files means any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract, whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, videotaped, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. Bottom line, every record you have, every record you create, every record you read, you use, you study, becomes a public record by definition. And in theory, anybody, and I do mean anybody, can ask to see that record or can ask you for a copy of it. And folks, it's that simple, except on top of those base definitions, we have what we call in the FOI business, the 3 E's. There are exceptions, there are exclusions, and there are exemptions. I referenced a couple of them when we talked about that fifth reason for executive session. There are, dozens of ways that records can or should be withheld. We could spend hours talking about them, but what I want you to do is focus on the fact that everything is by definition a public record. If you don't want to see it on the front page of the New London Day, don't send it. Be smart about it, but understand that if somebody wants to see it, they can make a request. So if, you have a lot of people in your town who know about freedom of information, starting with your town clerk. She's very good with freedom of information, but people can help you Let's suppose you, as a council member or as a Board of Finance member or Board of Ed member, get a request for records. Well, what do? What you do is make sure that there is a response in 4 business days. Respond doesn't necessarily mean to produce the record. It means, thank you for your request. We're looking into it. We'll get you the records. Anything that doesn't fall under one of those exemptions or exceptions, we'll get you the records. Then you need to produce whatever records are responsive and not exempt in prompt fashion. Remember that a lot of people will come with an FOI request and say, I want it and I want it now. And I suspect some of you have had that or been a party to that. Immediate access is not required under Freedom of Information. Prompt access is. Now people say, well, what the heck does prompt mean? Well, nobody knew what it meant. It went to court very early in the life of the law, and the court said prompt means without undue delay. I get a chuckle out of that. What does that mean? Well, I would like a deadline. I'd like somebody to tell me you've got 2 weeks, 2 days, 3 months. You don't. So you, again, we talked about interpretation. You have to say, okay, well, how many records are they looking for? Where are they kept? Does somebody have to review them? Is that office staffed today? Are they closed because of COVID? Are they, or is it, are they short staffed because somebody's on vacation? All of those things come into play. If you're interested in, how the commission looks at it, we did an advisory opinion way back when. It still holds. It's advisory opinion 51. It's on our website. Sort of gives you some guidance as to what constitutes prompts. It doesn't mean that, okay, good, we have a lot of time. We're going to put this on the back burner. Access is important. You want to do it as quickly, as fairly, as reasonably as possible, but not at the expense of everything else you have to do. And those of you who are on boards and commissions, you say, well, I'm not using the town email account. I'm using my personal email account, so I don't have to worry about it, right? Wrong. If you create it, it doesn't matter what device you use, whether you're at home, whether you're at work, my phone, your phone, the town email address, doesn't matter. Once you create it, it becomes by definition a public record. And in theory, anybody could get a look at it or anybody could ask for a copy of it. I want to sort of emphasize that to share with you a little story that I've been sharing with people. This is something that sort of fell out, if you will, at the height of the pandemic. One of the major cities in our state had a law department that was looking for a senior legal secretary. And all of the work had to be done this way, electronically, on the phone, Zooming, all those things. So the head of the law department sends an email to a colleague. It goes like this. I would like you soon to reach out to, woman's name is redacted, on behalf of the law department, to thank her for her interest in the position and to inform her that we went in another direction. I feel that you have the most experience in our office handling these types of discussions. Here comes the punchline. After many years of breaking off relationships with your past girlfriends and flings. Did he really write that in an email inside the law department? Yes, he did. And to make, by the way, the email is entitled, Let Her Down Easy, Playboy. Who does that? What are you doing? So even if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that he was just trying to be funny, he's now created a public record that looks really bad. And you're thinking, well, how did Tom get that? Tom got that because we were still all remote, and this email dropped on the colleague in the middle of a remote deposition in a court proceeding, and everybody in the court proceeding saw it. Think before you send, think before you write, but certainly think before you send, because you're creating a public record. And you get a lot of questions about what do we say, but there are retention schedules. Again, Betsy can help you with that. But the main thing is to remember that when you're working in the public sector, in the public arena, we give up some of the right to privacy that we think we might otherwise have. And we want to be careful and do our work in public. And by the way, it's a two-way street. It's important that people know what we're thinking and know what we're doing so that they can engage, so that they can have a situation where they ask you the right questions and they follow the right rules. And so when it comes time to vote on a budget or it comes time to vote on vote people into office, they're well educated. There's one other thing, couple other things to mention when we talk about records. Remember that a public agency need not create a record that doesn't exist. You do not need to do research for people. The FOI Act is only about records that exist. So if somebody says, gee, I want you to make a list of this for me or do a search for that for me, not required. You only have to produce the records that you have. Again, if they're not under one of those exemptions. So we've got about 10 minutes left before you folks have to run. I guess, Lisa, maybe you'll be the moderator here and
We've got Councilor Franco.
Thank you.
Councilor Franco.
Hi, thank you. I have some questions, but I don't know if I'm just going to ask a couple of them and maybe I can email you about some other ones. But when you're talking about a meeting and what a quorum is, if it's on an email and let's just say like we have a council of 9 people and let's just say somebody's asking us to vote a certain way for another councilor and 5 of them are on the email and the rest of the council is BCC'd on the same email. Is that still considered a quorum?
That's a problem. Yeah, first of all, asking somebody to vote via an email is not a good idea unless you're in the caucus mode. Unless now, you know, if you're all of the same party, then you could do that. But a cautionary tale on that, there hasn't been a decision yet as to whether or not a caucus via email, whether those emails would have to be released. So just sort of file that away. A conversation about how you're going to vote a councilor, I would say is probably not a good idea via email.
Okay, and it would be considered a quorum even if some are on the BCC and some are actually on, it's still because everybody's involved.
Yes, yes.
And then if we're electronic and we're in the council meeting and we're voting and some councilors don't come off mute at all during the voting, and because they say nothing, when it gets to like opposed and abstain, they say nothing. It's assumed that they voted in favor.
That's also probably not a good idea. I should say they would unmute and make it very clear how they vote. I would recommend a roll call vote so that it's abundantly clear who votes for what or for whom.
All right, and then when we're in a meeting and we're in, let's just say, responding to citizens' comments.
Okay.
And citizens come and they want to talk about something that's not on our agenda and they talk to us and we can respond to them. Can we start talking about in detail, like as a councilor, our thoughts and feelings on a matter that's not on our agenda just because the citizen asked us, like came and talked to us about it?
I would be very careful about that. My suggestion would be answer the question. By the way, remember what I said. You're not required to do that. Some boards don't answer questions. They won't engage. If that's your practice and you do that, that's fine. If they ask you about something that's not on the agenda, maybe answer the question. But if you all want to talk about it, you should stop, assuming it's a regular meeting, make a motion to add that discussion to the agenda and then carry it forward that way. Going much beyond answering the question opens you up to the claim that you've had a meeting that you've added something to the agenda improperly.
So what about if another different question is if you are on social media and you post things about town business, like, are we allowed to put out what our opinions are and where we stand on matters before we vote on something?
From an FOI standpoint, sure. Just remember that once you put it out there, it's a public record. But if you put something out there and Councilor Jones doesn't like it and gets into a disagreement with you and touches off a discussion among, that's when it becomes a problem. Just remember that when you put it out there, it becomes a public record and it's out there.
All right. And that's it for now. Thank you.
Okay. Who's
Councilor
next?
Borde.
Thank you. Actually, my question was answered. It was the voting. Sometimes reception. Once again, thank you, Mr. Hennick, for coming out and speaking tonight.
Happy to do it.
Sometimes it's the voting is going and you go to click and you can't unmute in the middle of the meeting, and then they already moved on and you didn't get a chance to unmute mic. So I think roll call.
My suggestion on that is the roll call.
Yeah, that's what you said.
And the chairman should, if it's not abundantly clear how someone voted, stop and make sure that it's on the record.
Yeah, and I think that's great because I think that is a firm, and there's been other meetings, not necessarily in this round, but in a couple of years past where, you're not even sure if someone's even actually behind the mic because they just move on. So I do think the roll call would definitely shore up that and allow for a minute for if somebody's mic was not working or their reception maybe dropped during that moment, you can confirm that. So, which has happened. So thank you.
One of the issues with, the virtual component is nice, but technology is still, has to be worked on. Everybody doesn't have the same technology. So clearly it's one of the ideas is to maybe get money to all the towns and cities so that they can improve it so that the electronic meetings can happen in a better fashion, I guess would be the way to put it. Any other questions? Any other thoughts?
Oh, excuse me, I can jump in because I don't know if we actually completed this question, which is when counselors or our members of a board or commission have a communication from a citizen, instead of that person being at their meeting, if the counselor or board or commission member chooses to relay that information, then they should say, I received a communication from Mr. So-and-so and what the subject is, and that's it. They don't have to read the whole thing, but you should at least know who sent the communication and what the subject matter was.
Right. I mean, how they handle that, Betsy's entirely it's a local thing. It's a personal thing. If you choose to, read it, you can, but there's nothing that requires you to do that.
We've had mixed bags, so.
Yeah. I mean, that's a call you get to make, but maybe a consistent policy wouldn't be a bad idea. I'm looking. Do we have any other questions? Well, you know what's going to happen? As soon as we hang up, you're going to think of something, right? Do not hesitate to pick up the phone and call or send an email. I'll get you an answer. Maybe next time we do this, we can visit in person, but I wish you the best. If there's anything we can do to help, just don't hesitate to call.
Thanks so much, Tom.
You're welcome, folks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
Appreciate it.
Guys. Have a good rest of your evening.